come any closer or I'll jump!
So this one game, Detroit Become Human, is coming out soon, and despite not being sponsored by the company that made the game, I figure I'd talk about it anyway. Well, not talk about it exactly, so much as talk about, like, non-linear video games more in general, sort of. Poor segue, I know, but whatever. You didn't subscribe to the channel because I'm good at scene transition. Honestly, if you're watching this, there's every chance that you didn't subscribe at all. By the way, please follow me on Twitter. So what exactly is non-linear storytelling in video games? That's kind of a broad question, so I'm going to approach it without nuance or context or anything else that might be expected of a commentator with integrity. I'm only kidding, commentary YouTubers don't have integrity. And just define it this way. A non-linear video game is any game where how you get from beginning to end is dependent in part upon player choice. That might sound right at first, but the thing about that is I've basically just described every video game ever made in human history. No individual plays the same game the same way twice. Half-Life, for instance, is a game I can play without going exactly the same route and using the exact same weapons each time. So that's a different way of playing it, making it a non-linear game, right? Well, no. At least not as people would commonly understand it. Most people, at least those familiar with video games, would probably look at the idea of a non-linear game and say that there's actually some alteration in the story dependent upon player input. This is where we start entering nuance territory. This does narrow the scope, sort of, but it opens us up to controversy a little where we start talking about certain games that we now have to argue fit into this bracket. The Telltale Game of Thrones game that they made to tie in with the TV series is one example. Sure, there are player choices, and sure, it advertises at the top of the show that your choices affect the outcome of the game, and sure, they do in a cosmetic sense, but the actual game doesn't change based upon your choices. It just doesn't. There's one choice at the end that sort of does-ish, which is to say it changes who the player character is at the end, but the events of the finale and pretty much the events of the entire game remain the same regardless of who you ally with, who you betray, and what actions you take throughout the piece. The plot alterations are entirely cosmetic. House Forrester, the Westerosi house you defend while playing the game, falls no matter what choices you make. Spoiler, by the way, I should have mentioned that. Is it possible then that this game is actually just a linear game, misidentifying itself as a non-linear one? The plot doesn't really change in a substantive way based on what you do. Is it possible that the choices you make are really just stand-ins for the weapons and route options in Half-Life? If so, then to call Game of Thrones a non-linear game, we'd have to call Half-Life 1 2, and Spec Ops The Line, and Bioshock Infinite, and Grim Fandango, and all the other games that ever exist in human history, and oops, we're back where we started. So we need to narrow our scope a bit more. What if the ending has to change based on what we do in the game? This is probably what people think of when they think of non-linear games. Games like Zero Escape, Fallout New Vegas, The Stanley Parable, and Heavy Rain. This works to a degree, but is it really all that fair as a definition? I realise at this point I'm kind of writing myself into a corner and being fairly nitpicky about definitions, but I'm a student of politics, and that's kind of my job. Does a game having a label of non-linearity hinge on whether or not the ending alters based on how you act? Maybe it does. After all, there's no way of knowing that your choices actually had consequences if all of them end up returning to one final single plot point at the end. But at the same time, why is the ending more relevant to a game's non-linearity than the events that happen in between? Can a game be non-linear and still be linear, if that makes any sense? Okay, so that's getting a little confusing, and honestly I'm only a little bit into the second page of this Google Doc and it's starting to hurt my head, so maybe it's time to move on. Just something to think about. What I want to kind of get into now is the practical side of it. How should a non-linear game be made if you want it to be, you know, good? For this, I want to kind of go back to two of the examples I mentioned earlier. The Game of Thrones game released by Telltale, and Heavy Rain, which was released by Quantic Dream, who are also responsible for Detroit Become Human. Do you see what I did there? I pulled it full circle. I'm kind of a big deal. So the Game of Thrones game, I loved that they brought Ramsay Bolton back. He was a funny haha character, especially in the TV show, and I liked that Lena Headey showed up to reprise her part as Cersei Lannister, and Tyrion was there, and all of my favourite characters were there. I also quite liked the flow of the plot. I thought one part fed neatly into another, then another, and I was really starting to feel connected to the world as the story went on. And I'm certainly happy to admit that for the first 5 episodes out of 6, I quite enjoyed the game. In fact, I loved the game, until I didn't. The final episode The Ice Dragon left me disappointed. It laid bare the fact that my choices didn't really matter, and to many people this was fine. It was, Game of Thrones, they'd probably argue. The whole point is that you suffer needlessly for ages on end and come close to something approaching victory or something like that, and then have it snatched from you. That's not how it felt. I felt like all of my progress, the progress I put into the game, had been for nothing, on account of the fact that none of my choices changed anything about the outcome. The outcome was the same, save for the character that ended up having to escape after the inevitable fall of House Forrester at the game's conclusion. And I get it. To make it so that there are multiple endings based on my choices would have been an insane amount of work. Say there are 5 chapters in a game, and just 2 choices per chapter. Through the power of combinatorial explosion, there are 2 choices branching off each previous choice, meaning it's 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, and finally 32 possible endings in a game that only has 2 choices per previous story branch. The amount of time that would take to code would be insanity for a game like Game of Thrones. Or would it? You see, this is why I want to talk about Heavy Rain, because for all of the game's flaws, and it has a lot of them, I think it tackles this mathematical problem really quite cleverly. You see, it's a non-linear game that masquerades as a linear one. The plot doesn't change based on what you do. You always end up trying to rescue Sean Mars at the depot at the end of the game before he, drowns or whatever. But the way they do it is different, and I think could have made the Game of Thrones game far better if they had adopted this particular development philosophy. You see, the way they made it, they separated it into multiple scenes, sort of like self-contained story thingies. Inside each story thingy, there's 1 or 2 things that might change based on, previous action, but largely they stand alone. Here's where Quantic got clever though. You might not see all of the scenes throughout the game. In fact, you probably won't. If you killed a character in a previous scene who was an important in a later one, then that scene just doesn't appear. So let me explain in kind of a generic kind of way. Say you're making a game and it has 6 scenes in it. Each scene is essentially like a scene in a film. There are characters that interact, and the player has to make 1 or a couple of choices based on what goes on inside that scene. The results of those choices determine whether, say, a character dies, or whether a character feels compelled to go somewhere or do something or whatever, who cares. Ultimately, if a character dies, or does or doesn't do a certain thing, you're locked out from seeing, say, this scene here. Your actions ultimately govern which scenes you do and don't see, and the scenes you've seen and the characters you've kept alive determine, in Heavy Rain's case, who was alive at the end to save Sean Mars at the depot, if anyone. That alteration is key because that establishes how the finale plays out, whether good or ill, and I think that's really quite an interesting workaround. You're creating a story that alters based on player input, without altering the story itself based on player input. Developing it in that framework would have saved the trouble that comes with coding multiple story paths, and made it feel far more like the fall of House Forrester was at least altered substantively by my actions throughout the game, instead of doing it kind of jarringly the way it does in the real thing with the whole 5 choices per episode junk. Have each episode be a set of scenes that connect to each other Heavy Rain style. You have to outmaneuver your political enemies in King's Landing in order to keep characters there alive, so that they're there at the finale, for instance. Or, you have to try and stay on the right side of the politics in Castle Black so you don't get imprisoned and thus unable to bring, like, the weirdo mystical army from north of the wall or whatever back to fight in the final mega battle or something. Whatever, I'm not on the GOT writing team. The important thing, though, is that that framework would mean there's actually options, and while those options are a little less direct than a list of choices on a screen, they actually matter exponentially more. You can keep the QuickTime events too if you really must. Whatever. So anyway, that was a ramble. I know it probably didn't really fit well together, but if you made it here, then hey, congratulations, you survived another loser video from Harry Awesome. If you don't hate the sound of my voice by now, then maybe listen to more of my voice by clicking one of the cards on screen. I don't know what I'm going to set the cards to link to while I'm reading the script, but you all can bet it'll probably be mediocre. Goodbye.